Welcome, fellow history wanderers, to a feast not of food, but of culture, where the silence around the dining table speaks louder than any spoken word, and every gesture, every bite, is a carefully choreographed act loaded with social meaning. Picture yourself sitting not at a casual modern dinner party, but in the hushed chambers of a feudal Japanese lord's mansion, or the stately symposium halls of ancient Greece. Here, dining was far more than mere sustenance. It was theater, ritual, and social chess, all rolled into one. Before you tuck into your next meal, imagine a world where speaking during dinner was not just rude, it was downright scandalous. Imagine that the way you held your chopsticks or the precise moment you raised your cup could define your very place in society, or even your survival. Sounds extreme. Welcome to the fascinating world of dining etiquette in feudal Japan and ancient Greece. Why such rigid rules? Because in both societies, the dinner table was a microcosm of the broader social order, an arena where hierarchy was enforced silently, through actions rather than words. Food itself was a symbol, and the way it was consumed a performance of respect, status, and power. These rules weren't just about manners. They were about maintaining the delicate balance of social networks, reinforcing the invisible but rigid walls that separated class from class, insider from outsider. Let's step first into the serene yet intense world of feudal Japan, where silence during meals wasn't just about decorum, it was a spiritual practice. Imagine sitting cross-legged on tatami mats beneath a minimalist wooden ceiling, surrounded by the subtle aroma of miso and grilled fish. No long stories or jokes here. Instead, the dining experience was steeped in Zen principles, mindfulness, restraint, and harmony. Speaking out loud was believed to disrupt the flow of energy, the calming grace of the meal, and by extension, the balance of life itself. Much like a violinist tuning before a concert, the participants were expected to prepare themselves internally, to focus not just on the food's flavor, but on the act of eating as a meditative ritual. Even the timing mattered. There were moments to lift your bowl, moments to pause, and moments to express gratitude through a silent bow rather than words. To forget these rules wasn't just embarrassing, it suggested a shallow soul, or worse, disrespect to the host's honor. You might think the silence was oppressive, but in this setting, it was empowering. Consider it the ancient equivalent of a social do not disturb sign, uniting diners in shared calm, elevating food from calories to ceremony. Of course, this intensity wasn't universal. Common folk had looser rules, but for the samurai and nobility, these prescribed manners were as rigid as their code of Bushido. Breaking them could tarnish your reputation forever. On the flip side of the world, and a few centuries earlier, ancient Greece had its own dining drama unfolding in the symposium, or symposium. Now, don't imagine a modern party just yet. While Greeks certainly enjoyed wine and conversation, dining here was also about asserting social identity and power dynamics, but with a completely different flavor. Symposia were mostly male affairs, where citizens gathered reclining on couches, passing around cups of diluted wine, while philosophers, poets, and politicians exchanged ideas. But this wasn't your average happy hour. The rules governing speech and behavior were strict, and silence had its place. Yes, Greeks loved a good debate, but knowing when to speak and when to stay quiet was an essential part of the etiquette. Interrupt or overtalk the host, social suicide. Drink too much, instant loss of respect. Show ignorance, well, prepare to be mercilessly mocked. Strikingly, social hierarchy was embedded in exactly where you sat and how you behaved at the table. The most honored guests were placed nearest the host, often the one who poured the wine, controlling the flow both literally and figuratively. Every gesture was deliberate, lifting the drinking cup, handing it to a friend, nodding to a point made in conversation. Missteps here could mean exclusion from future gatherings, or worse, public humiliation. The Greeks saw drinking and dining as educational as well as entertaining, a schooling in moderation, philosophy, and social grace. Food and drink weren't just fuel. They were a language, a means of negotiating status, alliances, and respect. The silent moments, therefore, became powerful tools. They could signal respect, contemplation, or, if prolonged, disdain. Silence was never wasted. It was part of the grand rhetorical game at the heart of Greek politics and culture. So, what do these worlds of silent meals and strict social codes tell us? They show us that etiquette, especially around food, is never just about being polite. It's the DNA of culture, the unspoken agreements that keep societies ticking. In Japan and Greece, the dining table was where identity was enacted, whether through silence or speech, through restraint or debate. These customs were about more than manners. They were about power, respect, and the invisible social forces binding people together or tearing them apart. It's fascinating and sometimes a little brutal to think that what you put on your fork, how you hold your cup, or even how loud you laugh, could change your fate in these worlds. Imagine having to remember not just what to say, but when to stay silent. Not just how to eat, but how to embody your place in society every time you sat down to a meal. Next time you find yourself in an awkward dinner silence, spare a thought for the samurai and Greek aristocrats who made silence into an art form and a social weapon. Because in these ancient halls and tatami rooms, the quiet between bites spoke volumes. So, as we begin to unravel the deeper rules and stories behind these intriguing dining customs, remember, etiquette isn't just about manners. It's about decoding the invisible social codes that shaped entire civilizations, one silent bite at a time. Imagine a quiet room, the faint scent of polished wood mingling with the subtle aroma of simmering rice and freshly picked herbs. No chatter breaks the stillness, just the soft clink of lacquered bowls and the careful, almost ritualistic movements of hands. This is no ordinary meal. This is a feast underscored by centuries of discipline, hierarchy, and unyielding respect. Welcome to a dining table in feudal Japan, where every bite is measured not just by hunger, but by social order. At first glance, it might look like an austere dinner party, pale faces seated on tatami mats, eyes lowered, barely a toothpick of conversation threading through the air. But this silence, far from mere etiquette or lack of things to say, was a charged form of communication in itself. It was about control, about respect, about knowing one's place, not just in the room, but in the entire cosmic hierarchy that defined samurai society. In the world of the samurai, order wasn't optional, it was essential. The strict hierarchy was as rigid as the armor they wore. Just as a single misplaced stroke could mar a calligrapher's scroll, a breach in dining protocol could cause waves far beyond the tea-bowl. Everyone at the table had to know who was senior, who was junior, who was honored, and who was silent. And the way you passed your bowl, or didn't, was a clear signal of that order. The dining table in a noble household was almost a stage where power played out silently. The master of the house was given the place of honor, usually the seat furthest from the entrance, a position that subtly proclaimed status. Younger samurai, servants, and guests arranged themselves according to rank, and moving out of line wasn't just rude, it was unthinkable. If you dared to reach over someone's shoulder for a piece of fish or slurp your soup too loudly, you risked offending the entire room, even the spirits. And yes, spirits mattered. Ancestors were never just a vague concept, but active presences whose gaze was felt in every gesture. Meals were often shared with offerings to these invisible guests, intertwining reverence with the mealtime's clear-cut order. Silence here was partly about respect for the food, for the company, for the cosmic balance, but it wasn't all stoic restraint. Beneath the quiet surface was a complex choreography of glances, nods, subtle hand movements, and shared meaning. Everyone at the table was reading and responding, even if their mouths stayed shut. Consider the chopsticks, a tiny slip in how you held, placed, or rested them could send a message louder than words. Rest your chopsticks upright in a bowl of rice, and you've just invoked a funeral ritual. A casual prank today might get you thrown out of a party in Edo. The samurai weren't merely eating. They were performing their identity. Through control and restraint in dining, they demonstrated their discipline beyond the battlefield. It was a quiet battlefield in its own right, one where a single breach could undermine centuries of tradition and social capital. Now, if you thought noble samurai dining was all about stern silence and rigid rules, there was also a certain austere beauty in the ceremony. The food itself reflected these values. Every dish was simple, seasonal, and carefully balanced, designed to please the palate without excess. The minimalist style wasn't just Zen aesthetics. It mirrored the simplicity and rigor the samurai aspired to in life. Picture a lacquered tray, meticulously arranged, with a small bowl of miso soup, pickled vegetables sliced just so, a piece of grilled fish, and rice as fluffy as freshly fallen snow. No gilded goblets overflowing with wine or mountains of roasted meats. This was humility, almost asceticism, layered with sophistication. Every element was given equal respect, no one flavor trumping the others. Like a good haiku, it was sparse but potent. Feudal Japan's social fabric extended beyond the samurai's immediate household too. In noble courts, dining etiquette was a microcosm of political power plays. A wrong move at the table could translate into political disaster. Here, silence replaced gossip, and shared meals were less about friendship and more about reinforcing alliances and displaying superiority through impeccable manners. In essence, food was diplomacy, served cold, without a single word spoken, but every gesture loud and clear. Yet, this tight grip on etiquette wasn't without its ironies. Among these lofty gatherings where silence held court, human foibles persisted. Beneath the masks of composure, there were whispered jokes, smirks barely hidden behind fans, and the occasional samurai desperately trying not to choke on bitter tea. After all, even the most disciplined warrior was only human, grappling with hunger, impatience, or a fierce craving for conversation that could never quite be voiced. What happens if the disciplined silence is broken? The answer: immediate social consequences. A loud laugh or an impolite gesture wasn't just frowned upon. It risked setting back a samurai's reputation for years. In a culture where honor was currency, such faux pas could render a samurai as vulnerable as an unarmored monk. The silent meal was, in many ways, a test of character as much as a routine part of life. So when you look at those serene images of samurai dining halls, spare a thought for the tension simmering under the surface. This was no casual family dinner, but a daily act of control, respect, and performance. A ritual where dining was as much about reinforcing social structures as it was about satisfying hunger. In the silence of these meals, a whole world of discipline and hierarchy was spoken, without a single word. And that, in itself, is a fascinating reminder that sometimes the loudest messages are conveyed in the quietest moments. Imagine a room filled with smoke from oil lamps, the sound of lyres plucking soft melodies, weaving through a crowd of well-dressed men reclining on plush cushions, each holding a shallow cup brimming with wine. This isn't your average dinner party. Welcome to the Symposium of Ancient Greece, a gathering that went far beyond merely filling stomachs. In a world where social standing was as much about brains and cunning as it was about birthright, the symposium was the ultimate arena for one's social and political maneuvering. It was here that wine and words flowed with equal, intoxicating ease. The word symposium literally means drinking together, but this was no frivolous feast. It was a carefully choreographed dance of intellect, influence, and societal graces. Picture it, a dimly lit room inside a wealthy Athenian's home, usually attended by a select group of citizens, not women, not slaves, and certainly not the average street vendor. No, these gatherings were strictly for men of status, citizens, soldiers, poets, philosophers, politicians, essentially the VIPs of their day. The symposium was a microcosm of Athenian democracy, a place where citizenship came with the privilege and responsibility of participation in public life. But don't let the casual vibe fool you. This was serious business. The symposium operated under a strict set of unspoken rules and rituals. First, everyone had roles to play. The host, or symposiarch, was king for the night, controlling the flow of wine and dictating the evening's tone, whether it veered towards raucous hilarity or solemn debate. The wine itself was never consumed neat. Greeks believed drinking undiluted wine was barbaric. So, ever the connoisseurs of moderation and excess all at once, they diluted it with water. Sometimes as much as 3 parts water to 1 part wine, turning potent Dionysian nectar into a social lubricant that encouraged eloquence over drunken foolishness. This was the birthplace of robust debate and philosophical banter, where ideas clashed like gladiators in the arena, minus the bloodshed but packed with verbal dueling. Famous philosophers like Plato and Socrates didn't just happen upon ideas by accident. Many of their greatest discussions took place in symposium settings. It was a place for testing arguments, throwing intellectual curveballs, and constructing worldviews, all while reclining comfortably and nursing a cup. If you think your modern-day dinner parties come with a fair share of passive-aggressive smirks and side-eyes, imagine the high stakes of proving your superiority with a cleverly delivered point on justice or virtue, while your peers sip diluted wine, weighing your every word. Social status largely dictated seating arrangements too, much like how the VIP table at a concert is never shared with just anyone. The symposiarch sat at the center naturally, while the rest gathered according to rank and favor. And if you blinked, you might miss some ancient version of a mic drop. The witty epigram, the cutting insult, or the joke that would secure your place in the social hierarchy for the coming months. The symposium showcased more than intellect. It displayed a man's wit, generosity in sharing wealth and wine, and his ability to entertain and impress the elite. Think of it as a cross between a TED Talk, a cocktail party, and a roast battle, all rolled into one. And then, of course, there was the entertainment. The Greeks, masters of dramatic flair, never let a night drag without some kind of spectacle. Musicians plucked lyres and sang paeans. Poets recited verses, dancers enchanted with fluid movements. These diversions provided a welcome break between rounds of debate and drinking, keeping energy high but never descending into chaos. Well, most of the time. The symposium was, after all, a civilized hedonism, a carefully maintained illusion of control amid the bacchanalia. But what about those conspicuously absent from this picture? Women, for one, were mostly barred from these gatherings, except for a class known as hetairai, courtesans who were educated and refined companions, quite unlike the average wife confined to the domestic sphere. Hetairai could hold their own in conversation, entertain guests, and were often prized for their wit and charm. Their presence underlined the symposium as a complex social ecosystem where exclusion and inclusion reinforced existing hierarchies while subtly challenging others. The politics of the symposium extended far beyond the walls of the room. Alliances forged over shared cups of wine could ripple out to influence the governance of city-states, military decisions, or philosophical schools of thought. One well-timed compliment or pointed remark might curry favor or provoke enmity, making the symposium a subtle battleground of diplomacy and power, where perception was as important as policy. What's fascinating is how the symposium served as an institution that blurred the lines between socializing, education, and politics. Unlike modern dinner parties where gossip dominates or Netflix binging kills conversation, the Greek symposium demanded active engagement, intellectual rigor, and a performative grace. It was a place where drinking was simultaneously a social duty and an art form, and where the quality of your arguments mattered as much as the quality of your wine. So, while the symposium might conjure images of excess and indulgence, it was also fundamentally a space of civic identity and social cohesion. Here, amidst the clinking of kylixes, the city's future was debated, reputations made or broken, and the bonds of citizenship both celebrated and tested. It was a reminder that in ancient Greece, dining was never just about the food on the table. It was a stage for the drama of democracy, philosophy, and power played out sip by sip, word by word. Picture this. You're sitting down to a meal in feudal Japan. The room is quiet, bathed in soft, natural light filtering through paper screens. The only sounds, the faint clink of lacquered bowls, a delicate rustling of silk kimonos, maybe the distant rustle of bamboo leaves. No laughter, no chatter, not even a sip. It's as if the very act of eating has turned into a solemn ritual, a silent communion between the eater and their food, their surroundings, and ultimately themselves. Sounds strange, right? In an age when feasting is often as much about the social buzz as the calories, why would anyone choose absolute silence while dining? This was no accident or mere formality in Japan's samurai era. It was a deliberate practice rooted deep in Zen Buddhist philosophy and the cultural fabric of the time. Silence at the table was not just about politeness, it was a discipline, a form of respect toward the meal, and a training of the mind to focus entirely on the present moment. Zen Buddhism, flourishing in Japan from the Kamakura period onward, redefined many everyday acts into moments of mindfulness and spiritual exercise. Eating, simple as it may seem, became one of these sacred tasks. The monks who first embraced this practice believed that silence during meals aided concentration and encouraged appreciation of food's true nature, its texture, flavor, and the countless hands that had tended the crops or caught the fish. Talking, that would disturb the spirit of the meal, scattering one's attention like leaves blown by the wind. Imagine sitting cross-legged on a tatami mat, your posture deliberate and your gaze lowered, while the chorus of silence presses in. Taking each bite slowly, almost ceremoniously, with chopsticks acting as tiny instruments of focus. There was a feeling, almost as if the food itself demanded respect, a reverence not only for sustenance, but for the cosmos itself. After all, in Zen thought, every grain of rice could be an incarnation of nature's intricate balance. But let's not paint this picture as some austere, full-on, no fun allowed policy. For the samurai, silence at the table was a social game, a form of control and hierarchy, just as much as an expression of inner calm. You didn't simply sit quietly because you were shy or dull. You did it because the unspoken rules dictated it. Speaking was reserved for particular moments, often led by the host or master of the house, who would grace the table with a carefully measured address or toast. Breaking silence casually might brand you as disrespectful or undisciplined, potentially damaging your reputation or social standing. And here's the kicker. Silence also forged a shared experience of discipline among diners. This collective quiet was a reminder that the group was unified in purpose, that eating was not merely a physical act, but a spiritual and social contract. Think of it as a medieval mindfulness session with rice bowls instead of yoga mats. No Instagram posts, no side conversations, just pure, undistracted presence. In fact, the meal's silent atmosphere was often intensified by the settings. Minimalist, bare rooms with stark wooden tables and subdued lighting, reinforcing the Zen aesthetic of simplicity and austerity. Loud noises or unruly behavior were taboo, seen as breaks from the natural order and the disciplined life feudal Japan prized. The absence of words allowed one's focus to sharpen, heightening sensitivity to the sensory details of each dish. The umami richness of miso soup, the subtle crunch of pickled vegetables, the silky texture of tofu. But contrast this with Western dining customs of the same era, where boisterous feasts and lively conversations were more the norm. The Japanese silent meal might seem like a boring, joyless affair to European nobles who paired their wine with endless banter and theatrical displays of excess. Yet Japan's approach was not about suppression. It was about channeling energy inward, a kind of social meditation that kept everyone aligned with shared cultural values: discipline, respect, and harmony. This story gets even more fascinating when you realize that silent eating served practical purposes too. In a society riddled with strict hierarchies, silence masked status anxieties and political tensions. The inability to speak up at meals forced individuals to interact in a more subtle, respectful way, avoiding potential conflicts or displays of dominance. More than small talk at the dinner table, it was a way to keep the peace and remind everyone of their place in the social order. Of course, this didn't mean that samurai were robots at mealtime. Humor and expression found outlets after the meal, when the formal silence gave way to relaxed conversations and storytelling, especially once alcohol was introduced. But during the meal itself, the silence was sacrosanct, a shared vow to respect not only the food but also the company assembled. This blend of mindfulness, social control, and spiritual devotion made silent meals a unique cultural phenomenon, and no small feat of discipline in a world without smartphones or sitcoms to distract you from your own chewing. Next time you get irritated by someone texting at dinner, just remember, in feudal Japan, even a whisper might have gotten you a kimono shaming. So silent eating at the feudal Japanese table wasn't simply about being polite. It was a ritual that reflected the values of its time. A marriage of Zen Buddhist principles and rigid social discipline, turning every meal into a meditative act of respect, focus, and harmony. A silent statement louder than any toast or chatter could hope to be. Picture a grand hall in feudal Japan, where the very act of eating was transformed into an exercise in silent grace. No clatter, no chatter, just the soft rustle of silk robes and the barely audible clink of lacquerware. Here, silence at the dining table wasn't just a social nicety. It was a carefully cultivated ritual, a language unto itself. Guests knew that one was to savor each bite in contemplative quiet, showing respect to the host and to the food, which was often presented as an art form. The absence of words created a space for reflection, an unspoken acknowledgement of harmony between nature, the chef's skill, and the guests' mindfulness. Now drift across continents and centuries to the vibrant symposium halls of ancient Greece, where silence wore an altogether different mask. At these symposia, lavish drinking parties that brought together philosophers, politicians, and poets, silence wasn't the backdrop to conversation, it was part of the conversation. But not because people preferred to stare at their bowls like monks in meditation. No, silence in a Greek symposium was strategic, dramatic, a tool wielded skillfully to shape dialogue, create tension, or command attention. In feudal Japan, silence at meals expressed humility and respect. In ancient Greece, silence at a symposium was more like a sly wink, a pause heavy with meaning, loaded with anticipation, or a scratchy silence, urging listeners to lean in closer. It was the pregnant pause before a witty retort or a profound observation. Imagine this. You're reclining on a cushioned couch, a kylix of wine in hand, surrounded by opias. Conversations ebb and flow like waves, full of vigorous debate and teasing banter. Suddenly, one of the guests falls silent. What seemed like awkward quiet is actually a calculated move, a cosmic ellipsis, commanding everyone's focus before striking with a philosophical zinger or a biting insult. The silence is suspenseful, a performance in itself. Contrast this with the Spartan tea ceremony of a Japanese samurai, where speaking out of turn during meals could be seen as lacking discipline or even disrespect. The Japanese valued silence because words were considered potentially disruptive intrusions, disturbing the delicate balance of presence and attention that honored the food and the company. It was a precise choreography, shaped by Zen aesthetics. The empty spaces between sounds held as much weight as the sounds themselves. In the Greek symposium, however, silence could be more playful and fluid, because symposia were about verbal sparring, camaraderie, and intellectual display. The pauses in conversation allowed everyone to absorb a complex thought, savor a poetic metaphor, or register the social consequences of a cleverly veiled insult. Silence amplified rhetoric. It was as if the air itself thickened, waiting for the next verbal blow or the laughter that punctuated a brilliant joke. You might wonder, how did these customs affect the mood of these gatherings? The Japanese silent meal generated a kind of solemn intimacy, where the absence of speech reverberated like a delicate temple bell. It demanded internal awareness, a communal mindfulness that brought people together without the need for words. The dining experience was almost meditative, a quiet communion with craftsmanship and nature. The Greek symposium was almost the opposite, a noisy feast for the mind and voice, but one punctuated by silence, so that listeners could catch their breath, so that the wielders of rhetoric could sharpen their swords of wit. These poses weren't empty voids, but charged moments, akin to a drum roll before a grand reveal, or a dramatic beat that heightens the tension in a well-written play. What's striking is that both cultures understood the power of silence in social rituals, but activated this power in dramatically different ways. In Japan, silence was about restraint, a peaceful bubble wrapping the meal in respect and formality, making noise less about entertainment and more about disturbance. In Greece, silence was a theatrical tool, enhancing the communal performance of talk, like the deliberate hush in a crowded theater just before the curtain rises. We could even see these contrasting uses of silence reflected in how the two societies valued individual expression. The Greek symposium was a stage for self-expression, where cleverness and persuasion crowned the dinner party's hierarchy, and silence was a weapon or a gift to this verbal dance. The Japanese silent meal emphasized collective harmony, where self-restraint and the shared appreciation of subtlety took center stage. In a way, silent Japanese diners showed you how to feast with your spirit. Greek symposiasts showed you how to feast with your voice. One invited you inward, the other outward. Yet both recognized that silence, paradoxically, could speak volumes. And think about the food itself in these gatherings. Japanese meals were often deliberately designed to be simple yet artful. Each dish a silent poem in texture and seasonality, waiting to be read quietly. The Greek banquet was more of a sprawling theater buffet, where food and drink fueled the spirited debates and storytelling, where a pause in talking was less about savoring ingredients and more about savoring the impact of a well-timed silence. It's fascinating how these different social uses of silence reflect broader world views. Japanese society prized harmony, subtlety, and inward focus, qualities reflected in their dining rituals. Greek culture adored rhetoric, individual brilliance, and public performance, qualities embodied in the lively, rhetorically charged silence of the symposium. So next time you find yourself in a quiet room or a lively party, consider the invisible scripts we follow. Is silence a sign of respect or a tactical pause? Is it a shared breath or a prelude to verbal fireworks? Understanding these ancient customs can transform how we think about dining and conversation themselves, not just as functional acts, but as performances layered with meaning, history, and yes, the complicated art of keeping quiet in a noisy world. Imagine stepping into a dimly lit Japanese dining room in the grip of the Edo period. The air carries a faint scent of tatami mats, mingled with the subtle aroma of simmering miso soup. It's not just a dinner party, it's a carefully choreographed ceremony loaded with invisible lines and intricate choreography. Everyone's posture, every movement, every seat is laden with layers of meaning. Just sitting down wasn't as simple as settling in with a bowl of rice and chopsticks. It was the silent language of respect, power, and social standing, playing out in precise spatial arrangements. Seating in these austere rooms followed strict protocols, rooted deep in feudal hierarchies and cultural philosophies. At the heart of it all was the concept of camisa, literally the seat of honor. This prime spot, usually farthest from the entrance and facing the scroll or the alcove, known as the tokonoma, was reserved for the host or the highest-ranking guest. In practical terms, this wasn't just about prestige, but about protection. By placing the most honored guest farthest away from the door, they were shielded from drafts or the possibility of unexpected visitors. This wasn't hospitality for hospitality's sake. It was control. The tokonoma itself was no mere decoration. This alcove, often showcasing a calligraphic scroll or seasonal flower arrangement, acted like the dining room's spiritual center. Proximity to the tokonoma was a tacit ranking system. Being closer confirmed your cultural and social status. Turn your back away from it, and you might as well have worn a sign saying, "Outsider." That humble scroll wasn't just art. It was a social litmus test, an unspoken judge observing who deserved reverence. Behind this serene exterior lay a rigid social map. Guests were placed on either side of the host, often on tatami mats arranged in a formal zigzag known as Honzen-style dining. The host sat quietly, positioned to control the flow of conversation and the meal's rhythm, orchestrating not just the food, but the very atmosphere. Each bow, each movement of the hand toward a shared dish was an act polished by etiquette. But here's the kicker. Despite these strict rules, no one dared to laugh at the unintended awkwardness. If you accidentally scooted closer to the camisa without invitation, it was a faux pas on par with showing up to a tea ceremony wearing sneakers. Social disaster in the making. Nor could you engage in casual chit-chat as we do today. This was a meal steeped in silence or low-toned conversation, a quiet battle of poise and restraint. Even the clinking of dishes was hushed, every sound measured and intentional, as if the house spirits themselves were listening for disrespect. Seating also mirrored the societal ladder outside the room. Samurai warriors, merchants, monks, or peasants, each group brought their own protocols. The samurai, with their code of Bushido, placed unparalleled emphasis on decorum and the subtle exchanges of power and loyalty. Being seated near the camisa wasn't just an honor, it was an affirmation of one's rank within the rigid caste system. The less important you were, the closer you sat to the entrance. It was not just about who had the first bite of sashimi, but about who merited the first seat at the table of respect. The intricacies could stump even seasoned guests. Seating wasn't decided by simple rank alone. Sometimes age, faction loyalty, or recent favors weighed in. A novice samurai with a glowing recommendation from a powerful lord might sneak a better spot than an older but less connected retainer. politics were everywhere, above and below the tatami. Silent yet thunderous. Try to imagine eating with your back to the camisa, or accidentally sitting in a seat that signals lower rank when you believed you were one of the honored few. It might seem petty to us now, but in feudal Japan, these arrangements were as critical as the blades samurai carried. The dining room was, quite literally, a battlefield of etiquette where a misstep could wound a reputation far deeper than any sword could. And it wasn't just about sitting. The flow of dishes passed was choreographed. Food did not merely circulate. It followed the social hierarchy so faithfully that skipping someone meant an unmistakable insult. Passing a bowl of soup to the wrong person could send a ripple of offense through the room, turning what was meant to be a simple gesture of sharing into a political statement. This table choreography reached its peak in the Hanzen Diori, the formal multi-course banquet style favored by the samurai class. Each course served in precise order, each plate positioned carefully to align with guest rank. Imagine being the lowliest samurai with only cold dango and pickled vegetables, watching a lord savor steaming rice with rare delicacies. Food became a reflection of one's place in the social cosmos. One amusing but telling detail was the absolute taboo against eating with your hands visible above the table's edge. Hands had to remain below the tatami, almost submerged to show deference. Today, most of us would probably choke just trying to keep a noodle submerged while maneuvering chopsticks in near darkness. But this was the expected discipline, a silent reminder that in these meals, control was everything. As you visualize this finely tuned system, think of a modern boardroom meeting, but replace the swivel chairs with cushions on the floor, and the PowerPoint slides with a beautifully painted scroll on the wall. Except here, your seat says everything about what you're entitled to say, do, and even eat. Missing the seating cues didn't just lead to awkward chats. It could mean social death, a fate worse than any samurai's battlefield demise, because it cut through the very fabric of honor. Dining etiquette in feudal Japan was a daily drama conducted without a single word raised in protest, a ballet of stillness and silent communication, where the closeness to the scroll, the host, and the entrance dictated everything from respect to survival. It was where social rank was not just asserted, but engraved into the very geography of a room, proving once again that in history, even sitting down to eat is never just about the food. Picture yourself invited to an Athenian symposium, the quintessential social ritual of the ancient Greek elite, an evening of wine, poetry, and philosophy, but also a finely tuned display of status and political maneuvering. Now, this wasn't your run-of-the-mill dinner party where you could flop down anywhere like a couch potato, binge-watching Netflix. Nope. Seating positions here were as calculated and consequential as a modern-day political debate. The arrangement of the lectus, the semicircular couch on which the guests reclined, was the main stage where social hierarchies flaunted themselves more effectively than any toga could. The lectus wasn't just a piece of furniture, it was a throne, a badge, a battlefield. Guests would recline on their left elbow, the right hand free to eat or gesture, a posture both relaxed and elegant. Each couch formed a curved line against the walls of the dining room, with the host nestling at the center of this half-moon, where he could watch and control the spectacle. The closer you were to the host, the higher your status, a concept both painfully obvious and ruthlessly enforced. But spacing wasn't arbitrary. Think of it as the ancient Greek version of who gets to sit next to the CEO at the company Christmas party. The premier spot, known as the clean-tes praetonis, was reserved for the guest of greatest honor, often a political ally, or someone whose favor the host coveted. The proximity to the host allowed subtle whispers and private exchanges, whispered promises or veiled threats, glazed in the sweet honey of wine and flattery. Farther along the line, a guest's distance was a clear public statement. You're appreciated, but don't get too comfortable, and definitely don't think you're equal to the heavy hitters. This wasn't just about seating, though. Service at the symposium was itself a carefully choreographed ritual. The slaves or servants moved through the room in a rehearsed dance, carrying trays loaded with food and wine vessels, mindful of social rank as much as spilling anything on the guest's chiton. Offering the first portion of wine or food to the highest-ranking individuals was a public act of respect and recognition, a shy nod to Greek politeness, wrapped in layers of power plays. And here's where it gets delightfully complicated. The order of serving could also become a political minefield. A host choosing to delay refilling a particular guest's cup might be sending a not-so-subtle message. Maybe you're on thin ice, or your opinions aren't exactly painting you as the favorite thinker in this brain trust. On the other hand, lavish pours and early plate loading signified open endorsement, lubricating both the throat and the bonds of loyalty. One misstep in this intricate dance could mean social exile by morning. The wine-fueled conversations were tough enough without adding the sting of rejection into the mix. Within the confines of the symposium, every bite, every sip, every gesture was an opportunity to assert one's place or to maneuver strategically through the volatile landscape of Athenian politics and society. These events were not just about enjoying food, but about showcasing one's place in the tapestry of relationships that kept the polis humming. It was a world where intellectual and culinary pleasures wove together, and where your proximity to the host could flip your fate or clarify your social rank with stark brutality. The lectus itself was more than just a tool for comfort and display. It was a symbol of status in the truest sense. Nobles and influential figures could expect cushions, carpets, or even extra padding, signaling their deserved comfort. Meanwhile, lesser guests might be left to recline with only the bare wood beneath them, if they even earned a couch at all. And yes, there was sometimes a covert struggle among guests for the best couches. Imagine the social faux pas of accidentally settling for a spot too far from the center, or worse, catching a chance glance of a higher-ranked individual giving you the side-eye because you dared to speak up too loudly from the periphery. But let's not romanticize too much. Despite the civility, these seating arrangements could be an endless source of tension and quiet resentment. The Greeks were master manipulators of status cues, and the symposium functioned like a high-stakes poker game where everyone's chips were their social capital, and the slightest misread could cost you dearly. This is why the host's role was crucial, not only as entertainer, but as referee and power broker, whose decisions about where and when to seat certain guests could consolidate or fracture alliances. Politically, the symposium was a microcosm of the polis itself. The same interpersonal dramas that played out over food and wine, favors granted or withheld, alliances formed or broken, echoed in the assembly and the courts. If you wanted to be part of the decision-making elite, mastering the art of subtle dining diplomacy was non-negotiable. It was like navigating a minefield of delicate egos and growing ambitions, while balancing on a couch that could very well be your social downfall or ladder. Interestingly, the symbolism of space and service didn't stop once dinner concluded. The symposiast's different roles continued into the post-meal entertainment: music, poetry recitations, games, where the initial seating's social order often dictated who participated or merely watched. The company, created by the host, was curated carefully, with every element reinforcing public recognition or marginalization. Reclining together in this highly ritualized setting was as much an exercise in group identity as a feast for the body. So, the next time you sit down for a dinner party and complain about having to sit next to Aunt Karen or that awkward cousin, remember that for the Greeks, who ended up right next to the host wasn't just discomfort, it was destiny decided by who you knew and whether you counted. The lectus was their power throne, the sweet nectar spilled onto its cushions, a currency of friendship, influence, and ambition. It's dining with the side of political chess, and a reminder that sometimes who you sit next to at the table is much more important than what's on the plate. There's something quietly mesmerizing about the clink of lacquerware and the gentle tap of chopsticks assembling a meal in feudal Japan. This wasn't just dinner. It was an event steeped in ritual, aesthetics, and a deeply rooted cultural choreography that whispered ideals of humility, respect, and harmony. Imagine a table not just set with food, but meticulously curated as an artistic statement, a symphony of muted colors, subtle shapes, and deliberate restraint that invited diners to experience the meal as a kind of silent meditation. The chopsticks weren't mere utensils. They were tiny conductors of behavior, demanding precision, etiquette, and reverence. In the delicate world of Japanese dining during the feudal era, chopsticks had rules so strict you could almost hear a stern grandmother's voice admonishing every faux pas. Picking up a single grain of rice, a yes, and a practiced feat. Stabbing food as if it were an enemy to be conquered, a social sin worse than forgetting your neighbor's name. The chopsticks themselves were often lacquered, smooth and glossy, reflecting the light in a way that made the simplest meal feel as precious as a jewel box opening on a royal court's banquet. Lacquerware, you see, was the star of the show, not only for its stunning beauty, but for what it signified. Each bowl or plate was a crafted masterpiece, layered with urushi lacquer made from the sap of the lacquer tree, polished to a glass-like sheen. These weren't just containers for food, they were sacred vessels designed to enhance the sensory experience through sight and touch before the flavors even hit the tongue. The weight of a lacquer bowl in one's hand was a reminder. This meal isn't just nourishment, it's a moment of connection with nature, the craftsmanship of countless artisans, and the unspoken rules of social order. Food presentation did not scream, "Look at me." In fact, it did almost the opposite. The arrangement of dishes was humble, careful, unpretentious, and yet profoundly aesthetic. The food itself was sliced and arranged with such precision that it resembled a brush painting, delicate, fleeting beauty. There was no room here for the gaudy or ostentatious. The meal was a conversation in subtlety, a poetic expression of transience, and an offering of respect both to the ingredients and to the guests. And let's be honest, this emphasis on humility wasn't just a cultural poetry. It served a very real social function. The careful, quiet handling of utensils, the muted color palette of the lacquerware, the restrained flavors, balanced just so, all worked together to keep egos in check. Dining was a stage where hierarchy was reinforced, not through loud proclamations or ostentatious displays, but via silence, respect, and impeccable manners. Your ability to navigate these unspoken codes marked you as educated, refined, and socially adept, or at the very least, someone who didn't want to be the reason the tea ceremony turned into an unscripted comedy. The act of eating itself was a performance of harmony. Guests took care not to speak loudly or interrupt each other, the focus constantly circling back to the meal and its ephemeral beauty. In a society where nature was venerated and seasons celebrated in poetry and painting, the food's presentation mimicked the fleeting elegance of cherry blossoms falling or autumn leaves drifting, a reminder that even the simplest meal carries the weight of the universe's cycles. There was also a practical reason for this silence: the language of respect. The Japanese believed that loud or careless eating disrupted the delicate balance of the moment, breaking the spirit of the meal. Consider this: to eat noisily was to behave like a wild animal, an image entirely incompatible with the cultivated and restrained ideals they aspired to. So diners practice silence, punctuated only by the occasional clink of lacquerware or a discreet sipped broth. It was almost like dining with an unspoken agreement. No unnecessary words, just appreciation and mindfulness. This obsession with harmony was echoed in the way chopsticks were handled between courses, resting them properly, never crossing them, never passing food from chopstick to chopstick, each gesture a silent syllable in a conversation of etiquette. Crossing chopsticks, that was a funeral ritual, not your dinner party. Passing food directly from one person's chopsticks to another's, again, mortuary customs, not table manners. Breaking these taboos was akin to announcing that you had zero clue about how the social world functioned, a faux pas that could leave you socially excommunicated before dessert arrived. Lacquerware further reinforced these cultural principles because it demanded care. The surfaces were delicate, susceptible to heat and scratches, and every chip was a reminder of impermanence. Handling these bowls required respect, a gentle touch, and mindfulness. During meals, the host or servants would often polish or arrange the lacquer pieces in ways that delighted the senses, demonstrating that even the act of setting the table was imbued with artistry and intention. In contrast, the aesthetics of ancient Greece, while different in material and style, shared this undercurrent of ritual that intertwined visual appeal with social function. Their pottery, much like Japanese lacquerware, was not simply functional, but storytelling vessels, depicting myths, valor, and sometimes even biting satire. But where Japanese lacquer emphasized muted beauty and silent homage, Greek dining often displayed vivid paintings of gods and heroes, their symposiums shaped by spirited conversation as much as by the wine and food. Still, Greek dining customs echoed that same respect for order within the chaos of the feast. Courses were presented with flair, glasses were filled with ritualized toasts, and the layout of the triclinium, the dining couch arrangement, was steeped in significance. Each physical placement a nod to social hierarchy and honor. The cutting and sharing of meat, the pouring of wine diluted just so, even the passing of bread were acts performed with an awareness of social harmony, a balancing act of inclusion and exclusion. Returning to the Japanese table, you can't help but be struck by the elegance of restraint, how something as simple as a meal becomes a ceremony that knits together social values, personal humility, and a respect for the ephemeral beauty of life. The chopsticks, lacquerware, and presentation style weren't merely practical. They were tangible expressions of cultural ideals. Together, they created an environment where harmony wasn't simply desired but expected, where silence was golden, and where even the act of eating became a gesture of respect toward all that the meal represented. So next time you pick up your chopsticks, perhaps with less ceremony and more eagerness, remember this ancient dance of hands and bowls, a slow, graceful waltz where every flicker of polished lacquer and every gentle pinch holds 1,000 years of social wisdom. Because in the world of feudal Japan, dining was never just about filling the stomach. It was about filling the soul with order, beauty, and a profound sense of connection to something greater than the hunger at the table. Imagine sitting down to a Greek banquet, the kind that wasn't just a meal, but a carefully choreographed spectacle of abundance and flair, where every dish, every vessel, and every splash of wine told a story louder than any toast. Now, before they even laid a finger on the roasted lamb or the honey-drizzled figs, the Greeks had already set the stage with pottery and servingware that verged on theatrical props, crafted not just for function, but to shout hospitality from the rooftops and beyond. The ancient Greeks didn't just eat. They presented their food like an art form wrapped in social significance. Picture a room adorned with kylixes, those shallow, broad-rimmed cups where wine met the lips in a dance of conviviality, and craters, those magnificent, wide-mouthed mixing bowls, almost large enough to bathe in if you were so inclined. Craters were the evening centerpiece, literally the heart of communal wine sharing that symbolized unity in diversity, a bowl where different wines were diluted with water, blending flavors and friends alike. Every swirl of that liquid wasn't merely about taste, it was a metaphor for balance, civility, and the fine line between indulgence and excess. But these vessels were far from plain. Many were lavishly painted, boasting scenes from myth, battles, or daily life, much like a Netflix series playing out on a ceramic screen. Rather than being hidden away, these pots were showcased proudly. Hosting a feast without the right pottery was like throwing a party without music, awkward and a serious conversation killer. Then there were the serving dishes, designed with a theatrical flair that feast hosts loved. Food wasn't just plopped onto plates, it was arranged carefully on phylae, shallow bowls often gilded or decorated with intricate designs, highlighting the abundance of the spread. Figs, olives, bread, and cheese didn't just sit there. They were stars on a stage of fine craftsmanship. A feast's visual richness was a statement. Look at what we have. Look at what I can give. Because in ancient Greece, hospitality wasn't just politeness, it was power. This display served a dual purpose. It created an atmosphere of generosity, a fundamental social obligation called xenia, the sacred guest-host relationship that could make or break reputations. No host wanted to be remembered as stingy or dull. They aimed to impress with an almost exaggerated opulence, even if the meal itself was simple. A wealth of vessels and plentiful foods declared, "We are rich, we are stable, you are welcome." It was social currency, spent liberally to secure alliances, friendships, or favor. And speaking of opulence with a side of drama, some banquets could border on the extravagantly absurd. There's evidence in the archaeological record that hosts sometimes staged entire performances with their serving pieces. Imagine a feast where food was presented in theatrical style, where a cup might depict a Dionysian revelry, not just to delight the guests, but to remind them of the god of wine's capricious power. Some pottery even featured slapstick scenes, almost like ancient cartoons, turning their drinking vessels into conversation starters, icebreakers, and sometimes subtle social jabs or compliments dressed up in humor. But let's pause to appreciate the subtle brutality beneath all this charm. The pottery, as beautiful as it was, also hinted at a society deeply conscious of hierarchy and role-playing. Each vessel had a place and owner. Not everyone could just pick up a kylix and join the wine-swilling merriment. The shape, size, and decoration could signify status. Mixing wine in the crater wasn't just about taste. It was a task for a symposiarch, the appointed leader who set the tone and pace of the evening. Step out of line here, and you risked being ousted not just from the table, but socially sidelined. Moreover, these vessels were delicate, wearable symbols of wealth. Pottery was valuable partly because of the labor and artistry involved. Breaking one in a drunken stumble wasn't just a spilled cup, it was a symbolic misstep, a glaring social faux pas, equivalent to an Instagram influencer accidentally posting an embarrassing selfie. No retakes allowed. Finally, the presentation of food in this refined context wasn't always about gluttony. It was about performance, the host's ability to conjure abundance in a land where harvests could fail and fortunes tumble. Displaying a feast laden with fruits, meats, and bread was an act of reassurance, a talisman against scarcity's shadow. It was a powerful message. Here, at this table, hunger has been defeated, at least for tonight. These serving vessels and their careful arrangements remind us that ancient Greek banquets were much more than meals. They were social theater, sites of power negotiation, and displays of cultural identity, art, and irony. Every sip from a kylix, every swirl from the crater, every glint off painted pottery whispered stories of a society that celebrated drinking, dining, and drama as one grand banquet of human connection. In the end, the pots were not just containers, they were conduits for memory, meaning, and the messy, magnificent rituals that defined what it meant to feast Greek style. Imagine sitting down to a meal where every bite, every sigh, every glance is weighed not just by etiquette, but by centuries of unspoken rules. A symphony of silence and gesture that tells you more about your place in society than words ever could. This was dining in feudal Japan, a world apart from the casual clatter we associate with modern meals. Here, silence reigned supreme at the table, but not because people were shy. No, it was a carefully choreographed performance where speaking out loud risked stepping on the intricate dance of hierarchy, respect, and subtle communication. In the austere chambers of a samurai lord's mansion, or in the humble tea rooms of wandering monks, the meal was less about chatting away and more about embodying restraint. The noise of slurping or chewing wasn't just frowned upon, it was an offense. The ideal diner was one who celebrated the flavors inwardly, almost meditatively, all while maintaining a tranquil exterior. Think of it as the original social media silence, a mindful absence of noise sending louder messages than any conversation. Why so quiet? Because in feudal Japan, where every class and clan had razor-thin lines defining behavior, speech was a power play disguised as politeness. Talking too much or too little could upset the precarious balance, unintentionally revealing ambition, impatience, or disrespect. A lord's guest who blurted out a joke at the wrong moment risked not just embarrassment, but diplomatic disaster. So instead, they mastered the art of the glance, the slight nod, the barely perceptible tilt of a head, conveying gratitude, approval, or displeasure without uttering a single word. But silence didn't mean absence of interaction. Far from it. There were rituals baked into the meal, down to the finest grain of rice. Before eating, a perfunctory itadakimasu, a humble phrase thanking all who contributed to the meal, was spoken, breaking the silence just enough to acknowledge the sacredness of sustenance. Yet even that phrase was uttered with a bow, eyes lowering in deference, indicating reverence not only for the food, but for the invisible hierarchy that underpinned every gesture. Chopsticks, those humble wooden sticks so familiar to us now, were in themselves a language. Lifting them with elegance was an art, but so was knowing when not to touch them. Stabbing food with chopsticks, or worse, sticking them upright in one's bowl, was taboo, immediately conjuring images of funeral rites and death, an ill omen nobody wanted to invite to dinner. Passing food from chopstick to chopstick, even worse. That gesture was reserved exclusively for handling the bones of the deceased during cremation ceremonies. So every movement was loaded with centuries of cultural significance, turning a simple meal into a performative dance with death, respect, and tradition lurking in every detail. Seated on tatami mats, the diners engaged in a silent negotiation of space and posture. Sitting upright, legs folded neatly beneath, revealed training and discipline, while slouching screened disrespect. The humble wooden tray was arranged precisely, with each dish carrying symbolic weight. To reach across another gentleman's tray without permission was tantamount to high treason. Every interaction was about maintaining and reinforcing social order without tipping the balance into uncomfortable confrontation. What might seem restrictive from a modern perspective was actually a sophisticated code system enabling subtle communication without disrupting harmony. A slight hesitation before sipping sake could signal doubt or caution. A tiny smile, barely visible, passed between trusted companions, conveyed approval or consolation. These covert signals operated beneath the surface of silence, like a secret language only the initiated truly understood. Even within families, the rules were labyrinthine. Samurai wives and children knew exactly how to behave during meals, the lessons drilled into them from a tender age. Public displays of affection, like praising the cook loudly or offering unsolicited commentary on the food, were frowned upon. Humor, generally reserved for later moments, after the official meal concluded. The dining table was a place of formality, of respect, paid in the currency of restraint. It was not the venue for messy emotions or loud opinions. Yet this intense formality did not freeze human nature. Occasionally, the mask slipped. A sympathetic guest might break silence to praise a dish, risking a minor breach of etiquette but humanizing the encounter. Some meals even gave way to almost conspiratorial whispers, furtive exchanges that in the midst of pandemic-like silence felt like fireworks. But these moments were exceptions, carefully controlled and rare in the sprawling tapestry of weighted quiet. It's worth imagining what it felt like for a young samurai in training, trying to master these dining rituals at his first formal meal. With adrenaline and nerves twisting stomach and hands, he had to navigate a minefield of silent expectations. When to pick up a bowl, how to move chopsticks, when to bow, how to swallow without a sound. It was a test, more than anything, of emotional discipline. A failure could echo beyond the room, affecting honor and alliances. The dinner table was an arena where the battle for social standing was fought without swords, sharpened instead by silence and grace. This wasn't just about politeness or hierarchy, it was deeply philosophical. The silence at the table mirrored broader societal values of harmony and the collective good over individual expression. In a world where actions spoke louder than any careless word, meals became a microcosm of feudal Japan itself. Ordered, respectful, and intensely nuanced. Conflicting emotions were controlled tightly, personal desires subsumed beneath duty and face-saving diplomacy. So next time you struggle to keep a straight face across your noisy, chatty dinner table, remember the stiffness and silence that ruled in feudal Japan. For them, silence was never empty or awkward. It was full of meaning. A dropped syllable, a careless gesture, a slurp too loud, any one of these could upset the delicate balance of respect and power, and perhaps even start a feud quieter than any shouted insult, but twice as lasting. Meals weren't just about eating. They were about being seen, judged, and understood through measured silence and subtle expression. And in that weird, whisper-quiet world, the unspoken social rules guided behavior with a precision that would make any modern-day protocol officer nod in admiration or despair. Sometimes the loudest conversations really are the ones that never happen at all. Picture a warm Athenian evening. The soft flicker of oil lamps casting dancing shadows over reclining figures draped in linen chitons. The air buzzes, not with the low hum of polite conversation, but with sharp wit, boisterous laughter, and the occasional sharp gasp. This is no ordinary dinner party. Welcome to the symposium, the epicenter of ancient Greek social life, where food and drink are merely the backdrop for a far more intoxicating feast, the feast of words. Unlike the silent, sometimes painfully formal meals of feudal Japan, Greek symposiums thrived on vocal dynamism. Here, silence was suspicious, and boredom was a social crime. The rules weren't carved in stone, well, maybe in some archaic law code somewhere, but the social expectations around verbal flair were as unyielding as the columns of the Parthenon. Not just eating, but talking was an art, a weapon, and a ritual. As the wine flowed, so did the talking, plenty of it. But this wasn't mindless chatter or awkward small talk. The symposium was a playground for competitive banter, explosive satire, and philosophical jousting. Imagine a cocktail party where the guests are armed with razor-sharp tongues, and the stakes are intellectual supremacy, social reputation, and sometimes sheer entertainment. At the heart of these gatherings was the symposiarch, the master of ceremonies who dictated the pace, not unlike a DJ setting the vibe for a party today. He would decide when the wine would be diluted or poured freely, when conversations would turn jocular or serious, and when to unleash the verbal sparring matches that made these events famous. Early on, light-hearted exchanges set the tone. Plenty of mocking nicknames floated around the room, some affectionate, others brutal. An overweight Athenian might be called pillar or mountain, while a cunning orator could be serpent tongue. These weren't just insults, but badges of honor, clues into a person's status within the shifting social hierarchy. Importantly, the symposium was a place where hierarchy could be poked fun at, a social safety valve that allowed the powerful to be teased, carefully of course, and the witty to rise in stature. The Greek love of satire was more than just party fodder. Poets and playwrights honed their craft on the symposium floor, often as the guests themselves, launching pointed critiques at everything from politics and philosophy to the foibles of the gods. Imagine cracking jokes that could topple reputations more effectively than any vote in the assembly. The symposium was a gladiatorial arena where words cut deeper than any sword. But it wasn't all jabs and jests. The very core of these gatherings was intellectual engagement. Serious debates about ethics, metaphysics, politics, and the nature of the cosmos broke out regularly. Here, competing schools of thought clashed with passion. The followers of Socrates, known for their relentless questioning, would drive conversation to the edge, seeking clarity in the murky depths of existence. It was a chance to challenge friends and foes alike, without fear of social reprisal, under the cloak of conviviality and mutual respect. The masterful oratory was not merely for amusement or persuasion. It was a tool for personal and civic excellence. In an era when much political power was wielded by those who could speak well, the symposium was a training ground, a place to sharpen one's rhetorical skills over cups of diluted wine and fresh bread. It blurred the boundaries between leisure and responsibility in a way that modern dinner parties seldom do. One can almost hear the clash of dialects, the rise and fall of voices animated by debate or laughter, bursts of applause for a particularly clever epigram, or groans from a poorly executed jest. It was a high-energy atmosphere that rewarded sharp minds and quick tongues, qualities that were treasured in Greek society as reflections of intelligence and virtue. Interestingly, the symposium also included structured entertainment. Performers, aulos players, dancers, and even reciters of epic poetry enlivened the room, but never dominated the drama of conversation. Rather, they set moods or punctuated transitions between topics, much like background music at a modern gathering, supporting but subordinate to the verbal fireworks. Yet, the symposium was not just an elite male playground. Women, specifically hetairai, skilled companions and entertainers, played crucial roles. They were often well-educated and adept in arts and rhetoric, able to engage meaningfully with their company rather than remain silent ornaments. Their presence expanded the complexity and nuance of the dialogue, adding another layer of social and intellectual texture. Now, if you're imagining these scenes without a touch of realism, it's worth noting that symposiums could also get pretty unruly. The mixture of heavy drinking, verbal sparring, and human egos sometimes erupted into heated arguments or even physical scuffles. But these moments were part of the social choreography, embodying the tension between restraint and excess that defined much of Greek culture. So, Unlike the silent, almost ritualized feasts of feudal Japan, Greek dining culture turned its banquets into verbal battlegrounds, where speech was the real meal, and wine only grease for the machinery of conversation. It was a space where wit was weaponized, philosophy was social currency, and laughter could threaten or cement alliances. Here, etiquette wasn't about keeping quiet or showing deference. It was about speaking up, speaking well, and knowing when to listen. In this way, the ancient Greek symposium reminds us that dining is never just about food. It's a social performance, a theater of ideas, an arena where culture itself is crafted and occasionally spectacularly demolished by nothing more than a sharp tongue and an open mind. Imagine sitting down to a meal in feudal Japan or ancient Greece, surrounded by families, warriors, or merchants, each plate a silent declaration of social standing. The food itself was far more than mere sustenance. It was a carefully curated stage where class distinctions played out almost as rigidly as the rules of etiquette that governed the dining experience. This wasn't just about filling hungry bellies. No, it was an elaborate performance of power, privilege, and place. In feudal Japan, the samurai, the elite warrior class, were the undeniable stars of the culinary stage. Their meals weren't just about taste, but about demonstrating refinement, discipline, and access to resources denied to the common folk. Picture a lacquered tray neatly arranged with several small dishes, delicate slices of grilled fish, pickled vegetables vibrant with color, a modest bowl of rice, and a steaming cup of tea. Each item was chosen not just for nourishment, but for harmony, balance in flavor, color, and texture, reflecting the principles of Zen aesthetics that the samurai held dear. Their meals were silent affairs, consumed with impeccable manners and a kind of solemn respect that matched the code of Bushido itself. Eating clumsily or making noise was not only rude, it challenged the warrior's dignity. Contrast this sharply with the modest fare of the peasants, the vast majority of Japan's population who toiled in the fields and were closer to the lifeblood of the nation than the samurai ever dreamed of. Their diet was simple, often unimaginative, but fundamentally filling. Plain rice or millet, miso soup that could stretch a scant handful of vegetables or beans, and occasionally salted fish or seaweed. No lacquered trays or delicate tea ceremonies here, just heavy wooden bowls likely gouged by years of use. Peasant meals were noisy, practical. They didn't have time for silent savoring when work awaited. The kinds of delicacies prized by samurai were luxuries beyond their reach, even if they had the manners to appreciate them. And then there were the merchants, an intriguing middle ground, often wealthy beyond peers in the rigid hierarchy, but unable to claim noble lineage. Their meals reflected a peculiar blend of opulence and restraint. Though legally beneath samurai on the social ladder, successful merchants could afford ingredients that made their dining experiences markedly more lavish than those of peasants. They might dine on fatty fish, rice mixed with rare grains, pickles made from exotic vegetables, and even imported spices, all served on finely crafted ceramics rather than the earthenware common folk used. Nonetheless, merchants had to balance enjoyment with caution, for ostentatious displays could provoke samurai scorn or draw unwelcome attention. Their meals invited a subtle power play, showing wealth without flaunting it too boldly. Dining was both pleasure and a negotiation of status. Now shift the scene to ancient Greece, where social stratification revealed itself at the symposium, or more modest household meals. Here, too, food choices and complexity mirrored class divisions, but underpinned by very different cultural attitudes. The aristocrats and philosophers enjoyed meals bursting with variety. Olives cured with precision, honey-drenched figs, tender cuts of lamb, and a variety of cheeses. Wine flowed freely, diluted with water as an essential social lubricant. These meals were as much about dialogue and intellectual spectacle as they were about the food itself. The wealthier Greeks prided themselves on hosting meals that displayed not just bountiful ingredients, but also the cultural superiority of education, conversation, and civic engagement. Peasants, meanwhile, lived on a staple diet consisting largely of barley bread, simple beans, raw vegetables, and the occasional fish if they lived near the coast. Their meals were sustenance in the most utilitarian sense. Imagine enduring the daily grind with a rough barley cake and a bit of wild parsley, hardly the feast of the gods promised in myth. These limitations weren't just about economics, but the rigid expectations imposed by a society that equated food abundance with virtue and status. Merchants and tradespeople found their culinary identity nestled between these extremes, often indulging in varied regional products brought in from the expanding territories of the Hellenistic world. Their meals might incorporate spices, imported fruits, and delicacies even the aristocracy cherished. Yet they too faced social constraints, a reminder that wealth, no matter how visible on the plate, couldn't always buy acceptance. What's striking in both Japan and Greece is how even the simplest meals spoke volumes about who you were supposed to be within the social order. A humble peasant's bowl was not just shaped by scarcity, but by the very design of society to keep people in their assigned places. Meanwhile, the elite classes used food as a form of soft power, rich in symbolism, ritualized, and deliberately exclusive. But this banquet of disparity also came with a twist. In Japan, the rituals of dining celebrated restraint, even for the most privileged. The samurai's quiet focus at the table mirrored the disciplined austerity required on the battlefield. No blaring ego here, just a subtle insistence that refinement was in control. One might say their meals were less about indulgence and more about mastering oneself, even when the sashimi was the freshest and the tea the finest. In Greece, dining was about the art of conversation as much as the food. The lavish symposia bonded men through discourse, philosophy, and sometimes politics, creating a space where elite identity was both consumed and performed. The dishes were almost props to fuel verbal sparring rather than mere deliciousness. And then there is the underlying irony. Both cultures revered silence and propriety in different ways. Japanese meals were often marked by quiet reverence, where noise was a breach of etiquette. Greek banquets, while lively with talk, still enforced rules. No one could eat like a slob, and indulgence had to be controlled lest chaos reign. Food was never just food. It was a message, carefully crafted and received, reinforcing the invisible walls between classes. So, the next time you sit down to a meal, consider, what does your plate say about you? While fast food or home-cooked simplicity may seem divorced from feudal samurai or Athenian aristocrats, we're all part of an ongoing story where food reflects identity, power, and place. If not always in silent dignity, then certainly in the cultural clatter of our times. Imagine for a moment being whisked away to ancient Athens around the 5th century BCE. The sun dips low, casting a golden haze over marble columns and olive groves. You're invited, privileged beyond most, to a symposium, not a quiet dinner party or a casual get-together, but a ritual where drinking wine isn't just about pleasure. It's a performance of power, politics, and social boundaries. The symposium was far more than a convivial evening. It was a crucible where political status, citizenship rights, and social hierarchies were on full public display. Think of it as the ultimate networking event in togas. But instead of influencers or CEOs, the attendees were Athenian elite men, armed with wit, poetry, and enough wine to loosen even the most disciplined philosopher's tongue. Participation was a badge of honor, an entry ticket to a club that codified who was in and who was mercifully out. But this club wasn't just about socializing. It was a direct reflection of who wielded citizenship and who was excluded from it. To be invited to a symposium meant you were recognized as a polis citizen, a participant in the political life of the city. Not surprisingly, women, slaves, metics, resident foreigners, and the downright unworthy were absent from the guest list. They weren't just politely left off the invitations, they literally weren't allowed within the walls of these gatherings. Citizenship in Athens wasn't just a legal status, it was a key to a secret garden where you sipped wine, discussed philosophy, debated politics, and made alliances that could sway the fate of the city-state. Interestingly, the symposium itself was a highly structured event. It began after dinner, once the food was served and eaten, allowing the focus to shift exclusively to the wine and conversation. But don't picture these men just getting sloshed for fun. The cup was passed round not blindly, but with a sophisticated system. The symposiarch, usually the host or chosen figure, regulated the amount of wine poured, ensuring the conversation remained spirited but not sloppy. It was a delicate dance, getting drunk enough to loosen tongues, but not so much as to lose control or dignity. Because in Athens, decorum mattered. Reputation could make or break you. This was a space that combined the democratic ideals for which Athens is celebrated, with its far less glamorous side, the stark exclusion based on birthright and social rank. Everyone at the symposium shared the privilege of citizenship, which carried certain rights and responsibilities in the democratic assembly outside these private rooms. Yet, ironically, the very exclusivity of these gatherings underscored Athens' limitations. Democracy in practice wasn't about universal inclusion. It was a narrow club of free, male, landowning citizens. Everyone else, spectators or shadows. And what of the conversations themselves? Far from dull, they could range from playful to piercing. Intellectual challenges to conventional wisdom went hand in hand with flirtation. Performances by hired entertainers like musicians or dancers, and rounds of drinking games designed both to entertain and to test participants' poise. Imagine your typical modern cocktail party, but swap hors d'oeuvres for olives and bread, replace small talk with Socratic dialogues, and throw in a few toasts to the gods for good measure. The symposium was these men's arena for social and political currencies, a place where philosophical ideas might ignite, and reputations could be forged or shattered. Yet, even with its veneer of camaraderie and intellectual exchange, the symposium was a mirror reflecting rigid social boundaries. The very setup reinforced who had access to power and who simply watched from the sidelines. The women who contributed food and wine, or the slaves who served, remained invisible in the background, essential to the event, but with no voice or seat at the table. In some ways, the symposium was a theatrical performance of the polis's social order, complete with clearly defined roles. The elite male citizen as rhetor and reveler, the entertainers who flattered or provoked, and the invisible laborers who kept the night's rhythm going. We get a particularly vivid sense of this exclusion from the fact that female participation, even in the form of companionship or casual attendance, was almost non-existent. Unlike the feast cultures in other societies, where mixed-gender dining might be common, in Athens, dinner parties of this sort were a fortress of male camaraderie, with rare exceptions mostly limited to courtesans or heterae who occupied an ambiguous social space. Their presence, though sometimes pivotal, further highlights the complex and often contradictory attitudes towards gender and citizenship. Women were fundamentally barred from political participation. Even their presence in social events was tightly regulated and often scandalized. The symposium's exclusiveness also hints at deeper political tensions in the Greek city-states themselves. Athens boasted of its radical democracy, but participation in symposium culture blatantly showed how this democracy was mediated by wealth, birth, and gender. Was the ideal of equality more rhetorical than actual? Perhaps so, as these nightly gatherings proved that some voices were louder and more listened to because of the blood in their veins and the lands they owned. So next time you imagine ancient Greece as the birthplace of democracy, think also of the symposium's dimly lit rooms, where the concept of citizenship literally drew a line between who drank wine together and who didn't get a drop. These silent meals, punctuated by laughter, debate, and the clink of kylix cups, whispered a story of inclusion and exclusion, a paradox baked into the very foundation of Greek dining and politics. Here, a simple wine bowl symbolized more than a drink. It was a vessel carrying the weight of identity, rights, and social boundaries. It reminds us that cultural rituals, even those seemingly about enjoyment, are often battlegrounds for power and status. The symposium was the theater where democracy danced hand in hand with privilege, and where every sip could reinforce or challenge the fragile architecture of ancient Greek society. Imagine a room hushed to a reverent silence. The flickering light of paper lanterns casts dancing shadows across lacquered trays, each dish meticulously arranged, not merely for taste, but as a sacred offering, a symbol, a carefully choreographed gesture in a ritual that binds spirit, society, and season together. Welcome to the world of formal meals during religious observances and seasonal festivals in feudal Japan and ancient Greece, a world where dining was never just about eating. It was a ritual performance designed to weave communities tightly through tradition, respect, and an almost obsessive attention to detail. In feudal Japan, the zenith of this ritualistic dining took place during the New Year's festivities, known as Osecheryuri. The cuisine here was not just culinary art, it was a spiritual manifesto encoded in food. Each carefully compartmentalized dish in those lacquered boxes carried a hope, a prayer, a wish for longevity, prosperity, or fertility. Black soya beans, or kuromami, one chosen merely for their taste, but because their name meant diligence. A sly parental jab wrapped in tradition, telling everyone at the table to work hard so they'd thrive in the coming year. Imagine Japanese families sitting around, not chatting aimlessly, but quietly, almost meditatively consuming these emblematic foods, each bite a step closer to communal harmony and spiritual renewal. These formal meals weren't casual affairs with clinking glasses and lively banter either. Silence was golden, sometimes literally. There's a rich irony in that. Here you have these elaborate social gatherings, sometimes with dozens of people, all observing tight social rules with such meticulous control that voices drop and personal expression mutates into coded gestures and measured nods. Talk too much, and you risked disrupting the delicate balance the meal was striving to maintain. It was like a live-action play where every Homo sapien had memorized their lines and cues, a social ballet revolving around food and decorum. The acts of eating then became a form of worship. Chopsticks moved with a deliberate slowness, conveying respect not only to the food, but to the ancestors and deities believed to be present at the feast, an invisible crowd joining the dining room. The meal was part celebratory communal experience, part solemn tribute. Across the sea in ancient Greece, the ancient festival of Anthesteria offers an equally fascinating glimpse into dining etiquette as a spiritual act. This 3-day festival was a major event in the Athenian calendar, dedicated to Dionysus, the god of wine, fertility, and, occasionally, the wild chaos that comes with overindulgence. Unlike the Japanese osechi ryori's strict silence, Dionysian feasts embraced a controlled kind of revelry. But even here, dining was a public act, filled with ritual significance rather than mere pleasure. Drinking from beautifully crafted kylixes, wine cups, was a serious business, and how much one consumed, and in what order, carried social implications, and sometimes invoked divine favor or wrath. The Anthesteria's first day was dedicated to opening the new wine. The very act of uncorking these earthenware bottles was a sacred rite, the moment when nature's bounty was transferred into human hands. But alongside celebration lurked sobering awareness of death and renewal. The spirits of the dead were believed to roam freely among the living during these celebrations, turning the feast into an eerie mingling of the living and the dead, a reminder that dining here was also a bridge between worlds. Hence, there was a codified etiquette, not just for shows of respect among the living, but for acknowledging the presence of the unknown. This traditional etiquette extended beyond the blunt fact of what was eaten or how much was drunk. It was also about who sat where, who poured the wine, and which songs were sung, because each gesture reinforced social hierarchies and religious observance. The symposium, an after-dinner gathering where men debated philosophy and poetics, was as much about visibility and performance as it was about camaraderie and ideas. One could not simply guzzle wine and spout nonsense. Instead, there were unspoken yet fiercely enforced expectations. A gentleman needed to be eloquent, measured, and, above all, respectful of the gods who were believed to be watching their every move. Back in Japan, the seasonal festivals offered another stage for formalized dining imbued with ritual. The cherry blossom viewing parties, hanami, while now often relaxed picnics filled with laughter and sake, initially had deeply spiritual roots. Nobles and samurai alike would gather beneath the ephemeral blooms to consume carefully selected foods that mirrored the fleeting beauty of the blossoms themselves. Meals were conducted with a delicate blend of reverence and social grace, a momentary pause to reflect on life's impermanence, an unspoken nod to Buddhist ideas woven seamlessly into the social fabric. The very silence that suffused these occasions wasn't awkward or oppressive. It was a social glue binding individuals together, compelling them to synchronize their actions in harmony with the divine order and with each other. These silent meals functioned as a societal reset button, a way to momentarily forget personal rivalries or petty grievances and unite in a shared spiritual and cultural experience. What's striking is how both these distant cultures, separated by thousands of miles and oceans, used the power of ritual dining to enforce social cohesion. It was a strategy born out of necessity, whether that necessity was to honor the gods, acknowledge the ancestors, celebrate nature's cycles, or simply maintain a fragile peace among warrior clans and democracy's elite. Their meals were not casual snacking sessions, but multi-dimensional events where every bite, every sip, every silent exchange reinforced a system that sustained entire civilizations. So the next time you think dining etiquette is just about not burping at the table or avoiding the double dip, remember these ancient feasts where what you ate, how you ate, and even the silence between bites could shape your social standing and spiritual fate. Silent, measured, yet vibrant through subtlety, these meals were a reminder that food is never only food. It is, at its core, a ritual, a language, a thread weaving together people across time and space into something greater than themselves. Imagine sitting at a long wooden table in ancient Athens, the air thick with the scents of honeyed wine, roasted meats, and fresh figs. Around you, your fellow citizens murmur prayers and chant hymns, all eyes fixed on the flickering flames illuminating the courtyard. This isn't just a dinner party. It's a communal performance designed to weave together the very fabric of civic identity and divine favor. Food, in this setting, is more than sustenance. It's a language, a statement, a sacred act. Among the many Greek festivals, none captures this fusion of dining and devotion quite like the antisteria. Picture this: 3 days in late winter, when the city of Athens pauses its regular bustle to honor Dionysus, god of wine, fertility, and, if you ask skeptics, chaos. It's a carnival of sorts, and food is the centerpiece. But this isn't your casual weekend barbecue. The antisteria is an intricate dance of sacred meals, cryptic rituals, and a dash of eerie superstition that would make any modern dinner guest uncomfortable. The festival's name itself comes from the ancient Greek word antisterion, meaning flowering, symbolizing the blossoming of spring and new life. But beneath the cheerful bloom lies an unsettling connection to the dead. The antisteria is not only a celebration of Dionysus, but also a liminal time when the boundary between the living and the dead thins dangerously. Think of a Halloween dinner party, but with more wine, less candy, and a whole lot of existential dread mixed with ecstatic reverie. On the first day, called Pythoagia, the jars of wine stored since the previous vintage are ceremonially opened. Imagine the crowd's anticipation, the ritual uncorking resonating like a symbolic heartbeat across the city. The wine, though a simple drink to us, was considered divine in its potential to both bless and undo. Drinking it at the festival was an act of communion with Dionysus himself. No casual sipping here. Participants engaged in communal toasts, linking mortal and God with every raised cup. But why so much fuss over a fermented grape juice? For Athenians, wine was a tool to connect the mortal realm with the divine, an intoxicating bridge that induced trance-like states and loosened the strict social binds of everyday life. Yet, even as Dionysus encouraged joyful abandon, ceremonies remained bounded by tradition and reference. The revelry had rules, a strange balance between order and chaos that demands respect. The second day, Choes, is where the festival silence is deafening, quite literally. This is when sacred meals are shared in hushed tones, emphasizing the gravity of the occasion. How often do we think of meals as silent affairs? In modern times, communal eating is almost synonymous with conversation and social bonding, yet in ancient Athens, this silence was layered with meaning. It was not uncomfortable quiet, but a shared, solemn space where words would defile the sacred connection to the dead and the gods. During Choes, people dressed in their best carried vine branches and drank wine from small jugs called Choes, hence the day's name. But they did more than just drink. They performed rites meant to honor the souls of the dead and invite them as invisible guests. The Athenians believed that during these days, the spirits of the deceased mingled with the living, consuming the fumes of wine and the essence of food offerings. This wasn't a gruesome séance, but a civic act. Feeding the ancestors was feeding the city's soul, reinforcing a collective identity rooted in respect for tradition and the supernatural. Imagine the eerie atmosphere, a table laden with sumptuous dishes, but pierced by the knowledge that some invisible guests lingered nearby. This was no ordinary potluck. The dead were treated with reverence, and even the mocking tone that Dionysian festivals sometimes embraced was tempered by a keen awareness of mortality. The melding of festivity and fear created an intoxicating tension. It was a reminder that the city's prosperity depended not only on mortal effort, but on keeping the gods and the dead appeased. On the final day, the Chitroi, the city took on a more somber tone. This was when the community offered a simple meal of boiled beans to the dead, a humble yet powerful ritual acknowledging death's inescapable grip on life. Beans might seem mundane, but in Greek thought, they connected deeply to the underworld. Their round black seeds symbolized souls and renewal. Sharing this meal could be likened to a silent pact, a collective nod toward the cycle of life and death, binding the living to those who came before. What's striking is how these sacred meals simultaneously fed the body and the social order. The anthesteria's architecture of food and ritual reinforced boundaries between the sacred and the profane, the living and the dead, citizen and outsider. Eating together wasn't mere civility. It was a political act, an enactment of belonging and divine favor. Meanwhile, the ritual silence and prescribed behaviors highlight the nuanced ways food shaped communal experiences. Picture a group of modern-day friends at a restaurant, phones down, eyes focused, communicating not through chatter, but through shared rituals and subtle gestures. That intensity of being both part of a gathering and separated by something almost ineffable is mirrored in these ancient meals. And it begs the question, in today's noisy world, where meals are bombarded with distractions and surface-level small talk, what might we lose if silence in dining were considered sacred again? Or if food were more than just fuel or pleasure, but a binding ritual that reminded us of our place in the larger story of community and existence. This marriage of food and festivity is not unique to Athens, but it crystallizes a truth about ancient societies, that meals were never just about eating. They were theater, prayer, boundary setting, and social glue all rolled into one. Through the anthesteria, the Athenians inhabited a shared moment where the divine was tasted, the dead honored, and civic identity performed with each passing cup and bite. Across time and cultures, running beneath elaborate dining customs, there pulses this ancient heartbeat, a desire to share more than just food, to commune in ways that transcend the mundane. The silent meals and sacred gatherings of the anthesteria stand as a vivid reminder that sometimes what's unsaid around the table speaks louder than all the noise. Imagine sitting down to a meal in feudal Japan, not just anywhere, but inside the austere tatami-matted chamber of a samurai lord. The scent of incense lingers, delicate dishes of simmered vegetables and glistening fish are arranged with near-religious precision, and every movement, every breath seems choreographed to an unspoken code. Yet, amid all this silent ceremony, there is a telling absence. Certain people are simply not present at the table. Specifically, women are often relegated to the margins or excluded entirely from these formal dining rituals. Why? Because in this highly stratified society, where honor and hierarchy ruled not just the battlefield, but the dining room, who sat where and ate how was loaded with social meaning far beyond mere appetite. Feudal Japan's dining etiquette was less about enjoying food and more about performing status and observing strict social boundaries, particularly those defined by gender. Unlike the image we might hold of communal meals filled with laughter and shared stories, many formal dining settings in this era resembled silent theater. Samurai men gathered in rigid rows, their seating arranged strictly by rank, as eyes flicked not to the food, but to one another's posture and decorum. The women, wives, daughters, or servants were often not invited to these samurai feasts. To be clear, this wasn't just about exclusion, but about preserving social order through spatial separation. Women's presence could be seen as a distraction, or worse, a breach of the solemn atmosphere deemed necessary to uphold the Lord's dignity. It's tempting to assume that women in such a patriarchal world were entirely invisible in the context of dining, but the reality was paradoxically more complex. Women did eat, certainly, but their dining was typically a private affair or confined to designated areas behind the main chambers. Picture a noblewoman quietly eating a modest meal in a separate room, carefully avoiding drawing attention, while the men conducted their silent banquet beside her. In some elite households, women prepared and served the food, performing an invisible labor that underscored their essential yet subordinate role. It was less a matter of nourishing the body as it was about maintaining the social fabric. Women's presence and absence at the table marked clear distinctions of power. Even when women did participate in communal eating, their behavior was tightly controlled. Public displays of appetite or unrestrained enjoyment were inappropriate. Discretion was a feminine virtue. So, rather than the convivial dinner parties we might envision, formal meals for women often dealt in restraint, silence, and ritualized modesty. This was dining as theater of control rather than simple sustenance. The reasons behind this rigid gender partitioning reach deep into the cultural and spiritual beliefs of the time. The samurai food, bushido, valued stoicism, honor, and a strict observance of social rules. Eating in silence, in carefully assigned seating that signified rank, was an extension of these values. Women, associated with the private, domestic sphere, were physically and symbolically barred from the public theater of male power that unfolded at the banquet table. The notion of pure and impure, tied to gendered ideas of ritual cleanliness, also played a role in such segregation. Women's biological functions were considered a kind of pollution in certain strict interpretations, further justifying their exclusion from the formal dining space. One could say that in these feudal banquets, the meal was less about food and more about controlling space and reinforcing hierarchy. A vivid and sometimes brutal theater of power dynamics, with silence the loudest voice in the room. It's fascinating, too, how similar rigid gender divisions appear in other ancient cultures, including ancient Greece, where men and women were also often separated during meals. Though the cultural settings were vastly different, the underlying impulse to use dining as a way to signal and perpetuate social order is surprisingly universal. But let's zoom back to Japan for a moment. Not all women were treated equally, or unequally for that matter. There were exceptions that complicate the picture. For instance, geishas, who were trained entertainers, often played a unique role in dining scenes, though their participation was more performative than participatory. They served to both soothe and control the mood, their carefully scripted roles blurring the lines between presence and absence. Their artistry, music, dance, conversation, became a kind of edible garnish on the formal feast for the men, reinforcing male dominance by offering pleasure without equal footing. Moreover, some women of high rank exercised considerable influence behind the scenes. Though excluded from the central dining room rituals, they maneuvered in the domestic sphere, managing the household, orchestrating events, and weaving social ties essential for clan survival. Their survival wasn't about overt participation at the table, but subtle control of the environment around it, almost like conducting a symphony from a soundproof booth. It's tempting to look at these silenced meals and despair for women's agency in historical Japan, but even in restriction, there was resistance. Women's spaces, marked by absence from formal dining, became sites of their own rituals and solidarity. Quiet lunches in private chambers, the preparation of symbolic dishes, and the passing down of culinary knowledge were ways women asserted identity and continuity. It was a world where silence itself carried meaning, where absence was a form of presence, and where dining etiquette was a battleground for gendered control. So, next time you imagine a samurai's feast, don't picture a crowded banquet hall where everyone shares stories and laughter. Instead, think of a carefully orchestrated silence, a spatial arrangement as precise as a sword cut, where men displayed power through their very posture and restraint, and women's dinners were shadow performances in separate rooms. The food on their plates might have been simple, but the social rules governing who could taste it and how were anything but. In feudal Japan, a meal was never just a meal. It was a map of power, a script of social order, and above all, a stage where the rigid lines of gender were drawn and redrawn with each silent bite. Imagine sitting at a grand symposium in ancient Athens, the room thick with the scent of burning olive oil lamps and the hum of debate. Around you recline men draped in flowing hemations, sipping diluted wine, voices rising and falling in philosophical duels. You might expect such gatherings, the social lifeblood of Greek intellectual and political life, to be open to all, a melting pot of city-state citizens. But no, one glance around makes it clear. If you're a woman, a slave, or just a pleb with ambitious dreams, you're probably on the outside looking in, or worse, kept firmly out of sight. The symposium was not just a party. It was a performance, a carefully choreographed ritual that mapped out exactly who belonged and who didn't, based not just on wealth or birth, but gender and status with ironclad precision. Women, for instance, found their participation in these events strictly curtailed. Respectable women of Athens almost never entered the male domain at all. Instead, if women attended, they were usually hetairae, courtesans trained not only to entertain with their charm and beauty, but also to engage intellectually, to match wits and words with the men. And even then, their presence was highly controlled, part of the spectacle, but rarely part of the decision-making circle. The respectable wife, she stayed home, far from the clinking cups and raucous laughter, her sphere confined to the domestic. It wasn't just gender lines being drawn, it was slavish boundaries too. Slaves, who formed a large part of Athenian society, stayed in the background, serving the men who debated politics and philosophy, as if their opinions were the only ones of value. The idea of a slave reclining on a couch, swirling whining hand and pontificating on justice or the ideal state, unthinkable. Their voices muted, their ambitions discounted. Even their presence was functional, not participatory. They brought the wine, prepared the food, kept the lamps burning, and vanished back into service the moment they were no longer needed. These strict exclusions weren't accidental, but deliberately designed to reinforce the tangled web of social hierarchies. The symposium was a microcosm of the city-state's power structure, a tableau where roles were not only performed but enforced through dining rituals. The arrangement of couches, the order in which cups were passed, the seating assignments, all functioned like a social compass, pointing to who held prestige and who was merely a prop in the elegant performance of power. This exclusive atmosphere wasn't unique to Athens. Shift continents and centuries, and we find echoes in the feudal courts of Japan, where dining etiquette similarly became a battleground of social stratification, but with its own distinctive flavor. In a world ruled by samurai lords and rigid social orders, mealtimes were carefully choreographed affairs loaded with silent messages. Just as the Greeks used conversation and reclined couches, feudal Japan deployed silence, posture, and seating arrangements to convey status. Picture a Japanese daimyo's banquet hall. The low tables meticulously set, with lacquerware glinting under lantern light, the retinue assembled in perfect stillness, the tension thick enough to slice with a katana. Unlike the convivial, often boisterous nature of Greek symposiums, meals here were solemn, almost meditative, demanding strict attention to every gesture. Speaking out of turn was not just rude, it could be dangerous, interpreted as a challenge to authority. Women in these feudal settings were similarly confined, though in a different mold. Noble women might attend certain formal meals, but were often expected to maintain a demure silence, their role more ornamental than conversational. Among samurai households, women's participation in dining was constrained by codes emphasizing modesty and restraint. Their presence underscored family honor, but they were carefully kept within boundaries that negated any real influence. As for the lower classes and servants, their role at these tables was purely utilitarian, preparing, serving, and then disappearing quietly. Here again, the social hierarchy was not merely a backdrop to dining, it was the script itself. The exact position where one sat in the room could reveal decades of political tension or decades-old alliances. Seating closest to the Lord signified favor and power, while a few seats away hinted at suspicion or disgrace. The silence enveloping these meals wasn't just cultural decorum, it was a weapon. It enforced the feudal order as effectively as any sword. What emerges from both these worlds, Greek and Japanese, is striking. Dining was never just eating. It was a stage where social rules were enacted with ruthless precision. The clamor of voices at a Greek symposium masked the exclusion of entire groups. The silent restraint of a Japanese feast disguised a similarly rigid social architecture. In both, women and slaves, or lower status individuals, were relegated to the margins, their full humanity denied by invisible but unyielding walls. It also makes us pause and laugh a little at the absurdity of it all. Imagine the frustrated slave in Athens pouring yet another cup of watered-down wine to bored men debating Socrates' latest paradox, or the noblewoman in feudal Japan sitting quietly in her kimono, longing for a rebellious word or a chance at genuine conversation, much less a glass of wine with friends. The dining table, it seems, has long been a battleground of privilege, custom, and control. So, next time you settle down for a dinner party, spare a thought for the ancient symposiums and samurai banquets, worlds apart, yet cutting from the same cloth of social theater. Underneath the clatter of chopsticks or the tinkling of goblets lay endless negotiations of power and place, silent or spoken, excluding many by design and reinforcing the status quo under the guise of refined etiquette. Food, it turns out, is never just food. It's politics, philosophy, performance, and sometimes a stubborn reminder of who gets to pull up a chair. By the twilight of feudal Japan and the waning days of ancient Greece, the dining tables, once sacred theaters of rigid etiquette, silent meals, and carefully choreographed rituals, were quietly, irrevocably changing. What had started as expressions of social hierarchy and cultural identity began to mold under the pressure of shifting politics, foreign incursions, and evolving societal values. The silent meals, once so heavily steeped in decorum that a stray cough could cause scandal, gave way to something altogether different. But how exactly did these transformations unfold? And why did traditions that seemed so etched in stone suddenly seem brittle, ready to crack under the weight of the new world? Let's start with feudal Japan, where, for centuries, the tea ceremony's deliberate silence and the restrained, almost austere nature of communal meals echoed the samurai's Zen-like discipline. Silent eating was, after all, more than a mere custom. It was a statement about self-control, respect for the food, and acknowledgement of one's place in a rigid social order. But as the Sengoku period ended and the Tokugawa shogunate solidified control, Japan's doors gently creaked open, not quite wide yet, but enough to invite ripples of change. The arrival of Western traders and missionaries was like dropping a pebble into a serene pond. Suddenly, there was Jesuit chatter about communal meals filled with laughter, shared stories, and yes, even noisy banquets. The rigid silences in Japanese dining rooms now seemed a little, well, uptight. More importantly, the influence of these foreigners brought new foods and customs. Forks clattered, wine was poured, and the sacred silence was broken. Not immediately, and certainly not universally, but the seeds of change had been planted. Political shifts added another layer. The rise of the merchant class, the chonin, upended the old social hierarchies centered around the samurai. These urban dwellers had different priorities. Comfort, conversation, and enjoyment began to seep into dining culture, replacing the austere stoicism of the past. Imagine the highly formalized tea ceremony giving way to lively sake parties where people, for once, could let their guard down without risking honor or social standing. The strict code of silence eroded, if gradually, as dining became an arena for social interaction rather than mere ritual discipline. Meanwhile, across the seas in ancient Greece, the symposion, the quintessential Greek drinking party, had always been a lively affair, but even this institution evolved as political landscapes shifted. The earlier days of aristocratic exclusivity gave way to broader participation, helped along by the democratizing effects of Athens and the tumult of war. Here, too, foreign influence played its part, injecting new customs and sometimes foods into the Greek diet. The expansion of the Hellenistic world after Alexander the Great dissolved the boundaries of the traditional city-state. Suddenly, Greek dining was no longer confined within the familiar walls of the polis, but stretched across Egypt, Persia, and India. The symposion, while retaining its essence as a ritualized blend of drinking, poetry, and music, began absorbing tastes and habits from these far-flung cultures. Exotic dishes, spices from distant lands, and more relaxed social norms reshaped the classical image of the symposium. But something else happened. The rise and fall of city-states, the constant wars and political instability meant that prescribed social behaviors, including rules governing dining etiquette, started losing their grip. The old aristocratic ideals, where every gesture at the table symbolized philosophical or political principles, became harder to maintain when survival itself was on the line. More people were eating, but fewer cared about the sanctity of silence or decorum. Loud debates, boisterous laughter, and even heated arguments became the norm, rather than the exception. You might say the Greek dining room turned into the ancient equivalent of a messy college dorm party. Of course, in both cultures, the erosion of these silent, highly codified dining rituals wasn't uniform or uncontested. In feudal Japan, many traditionalists railed against the barbaric influence of Western customs, decrying the loss of the contemplative dining experience where one focused solely on the meal and one's inner discipline. Writers of the Edo period lamented the decline of subtlety and manners, comparing the noisy, raucous taverns to a kind of moral decay creeping into society, almost as though the sound of slurping and laughter spelled the end of civilization itself. Yet, despite these cries, societal momentum carried the tide inexorably forward. Similarly, in Greece, the tension between old and new values played out in literature and philosophy. Plato, for instance, had famously critiqued the excesses of the symposium, warning of the slippery slope from modest enjoyment to hedonistic debauchery. A warning that, ironically, mirrored some conservative critiques of Japan's shift away from silent meals. But even he couldn't stop the tide. By the time Roman rule extended into Greece, the dining customs had evolved to fuse Greek tradition with the libertine excesses of Roman banquets. Rowdy feasts replaced silent reflection. The gentle clinking of cups was drowned out by the roar of crowds and endless festivities. Dining was no longer simply a social performance. It was an immersive spectacle, competitive and extravagant, a far cry from the philosophical symposia of centuries before. Back in Japan, the Meiji Restoration was the final act in this slow transformation. The forced opening of Japan to the West was a cultural earthquake, dismantling centuries-old social structures. The samurai class was abolished, and with it, many of the strict formalities that governed their lives, including dining. the arrival of cutlery, the introduction of bread and cheese, then exotic novelties, and the emphasis on communal conversation at meals flipped centuries of etiquette on its head. Silence gave way to chatter. Hierarchy dissolved into a more egalitarian mix, and dining tables became places of exchange, not just of food, but of ideas and global cultural influences. What's fascinating is that in both cultures, the shifts in dining etiquette weren't simply about food or manners. They were reflections of deeper societal transformations. Politics, class structures, and cultural exchange all played starring roles. The quiet contemplation and strict codes gave way to noisy participation and loosening boundaries because societies themselves were changing faster than etiquette manuals could keep up. So next time we imagine a serene Japanese tea room or a dignified Greek symposium, it's worth remembering these settings were never frozen in time. They breathed and evolved, sometimes willingly, sometimes kicking and screaming, swept along by the complex currents of history. Silent meals faded, not because people suddenly lost respect for food or each other, but because respect took new forms, forms that embraced noise, laughter, spice, and the messy richness of human interaction. In the end, what started as rigid rituals of silence and restraint became vibrant, boisterous occasions filled with stories, jokes, and even the occasional scandalous toast. Food and drink remained central, but the rules that governed them rippled with the changing rhythms of empire, culture, and identity. It's the kind of historical twist that makes you wonder, is silence really golden, or is it simply a pause before the party begins? Imagine sitting down at a dinner table today, surrounded by friends or family. The chatter fills the air, phones buzz, music plays softly in the background, and spoons clink against bowls. Now rewind centuries back to feudal Japan or ancient Greece, and the scene shifts dramatically. Silence might rule the room. Manners would be so precise they border on ritualistic choreography, a world where speaking out of turn could be seen as disrespectful or downright rude. It's a striking contrast, but one that makes us wonder, why did silence and strict dining etiquette matter so much back then? And how do these ancient rules still sneak into our modern meals and social rituals? In feudal Japan, diners weren't just eating, they were performing. The meal was a carefully orchestrated ceremony, steeped in harmony, respect, and mindfulness. Imagine sitting cross-legged on tatami mats, each dish a miniature masterpiece, colors and textures arranged to please not just the palate, but the soul. Here, silence wasn't awkward, it was reverent. A silent meal was a way to honor the food, the host, and the spirit of the moment. Speaking too loudly or eating sloppily wasn't just socially frowned upon. It was like trampling over a sacred garden with muddy boots. Every movement, from lifting the bowl to sipping the broth, had a grace about it that communicated respect without a single word. On the other side of the Mediterranean, Ancient Greece had its own dining drama, especially during the symposium, a lavish, always male-only gathering, mixing food, drink, and philosophy. Silence wasn't the star here. Conversation was, but it was a highly curated kind. Wit, wisdom, and subtle social dances of rhetoric ruled the room. Still, even the Greeks had unspoken ground rules about manners. Interrupting the host or hogging the best wine was as rude as forgetting to pass the salt today. There was a clear social hierarchy, and seating arrangements, serving order, and even the rhythm of speech at the table silently reinforced everyone's place in the pecking order. Yet, beneath these differences, the Japanese reverence for silent meditation versus the Greek celebration of verbal sparring lies a fascinating common thread. Mealtime was always more than just fuel. It was a language, a ritual, a way of building community and demonstrating respect. Silence and manners weren't just arbitrary rules. They were the social glue keeping complex networks of relationships intact. Fast forward to today, and these echoes are still surprisingly loud. Consider the tension when someone breaks the unspoken modern rule of texting during dinner, or dominates a group conversation with loud, self-centered stories. We might no longer expect silence at the table, but there's still a code. Don't be rude is the new don't slurp. Using your phone, that's practically the digital equivalent of turning your back on your companions and ignoring their presence. And how often do we still see people subtly policing who gets served first, or who speaks next to maintain peace and hierarchy, even if it's as casual as who grabs the last slice of pizza? Silence, too, has a quirky way of showing up. There's a reason why chefs and food critics often emphasize listening to a meal, encouraging diners to slow down and appreciate each bite's texture and flavor. Even in loud, multitasking lives, pauses during meals communicate something powerful: respect for the effort of cooking, for the company, for the sacred act of nourishment itself. Interestingly, some modern social rituals almost mimic ancient practices without us realizing it. Think about the awkward silence that can descend when you start eating before the others have their meal, or the collective wait before everyone takes a drink after a toast. Those tiny moments are a subtle handshake across time, linking us to samurai tables and Greek symposium banquets. Could that brief shared silence be an unconscious nod to centuries of etiquette, where what you don't say meant as much as what you did? And yet, not all influences are gentle reminders. Historical dining rules could be unforgiving, often scapegoating the loud eater or the overly casual diner as a social pariah. The fear of harsh judgment through these unwritten codes likely trained generations to master self-control and politeness to an extreme. Is it any wonder we still find ourselves doubling down on table manners when we want to impress or retreating into silence when we feel out of place. At the heart of all this lies a basic human need: connection. Mealtime etiquette, with or without words, is a dance designed to weave us into the social fabric. It's about signaling, "I see you, I respect you, I am here with you." Sometimes that means avoiding unnecessary noise. Other times, speaking with intention and wit. It's the invisible choreography of social harmony. In an era where meals are often rushed, eaten solo, or glued to screens, the echoes of silent respect and carefully observed manners remind us that dining is more than just breaking bread. It's a ritual that shapes how we relate to others and to ourselves. So next time you sit down with a meal, pause. Notice the unspoken rules around you and the subtle ways silence or speech carry meaning. Maybe then you'll feel the presence of those centuries-old traditions humming beneath the surface of your everyday table, quietly bridging the gap between ancient feasts and modern social life. Imagine sitting down at a table where silence isn't just golden, it's the steel thread weaving together the entire fabric of society. In both feudal Japan and ancient Greece, silence during meals wasn't a gap in conversation. It was a powerful language of order, respect, and hierarchy. Far from mere polite restraint, it was a performance where each breath, each measured movement reinforced social harmony and individual identity. As we conclude this exploration, let's savor the profound weight behind those quiet dinners and the intricate social choreography they demanded, reminding us that etiquette is not a mundane set of rules, but a mirror reflecting the soul of a civilization. Consider feudal Japan, where the meal was as much a spiritual ritual as it was nourishment. The subtle rustle of silk kimonos mingled with the quiet clink of lacquerware. Speaking out of turn or misusing chopsticks wasn't just awkward, it was almost an act of rebellion. The silence around the table was pregnant with meaning. It signaled restraint, humility, and an acute awareness of one's place in a rigid social hierarchy. Everyone knew their role: the samurai's posture, the servant's unobtrusive presence, the elder's gentle nod. To break this silent harmony was akin to breaking a sacred code. It's fascinating, almost ironic, that in a world so obsessed with honor and valor on the battlefield, the most intense battles of control happened within the intimate space of a dining room. Now turn your imagination to ancient Greece, a society famed for its philosophers, dramas, and boisterous symposiums, filled with witty debate and drinking songs. Yet when it came to everyday meals, there was a sharply different rhythm. The silence rule here was less mystical, but no less critical. Yes, the symposiums were loud and proud, but the communal meal followed strict protocols that governed who ate where, when, and how. It was this mundane order that ensured the polis remained stable, a microcosm of democracy and social stratification played out on the dinner couch. Dining etiquette wasn't just about avoiding social faux pas. It was about asserting citizenship, defining male camaraderie, and drawing clear lines between free men, slaves, and women. The silence or subdued conversation during meals underscored respect for tradition and a collective identity that was as much about restraint as about pride. In both cultures, silence was neither empty nor oppressive. It was a powerful tool for cohesion. We tend to think of dining manners as shallow rituals, like holding a fork the right way or not chewing with your mouth open. But here, in feudal Japan and ancient Greece, table manners were thick with cultural gravity. They disciplined bodies and minds, shaping individuals to fit the collective ideals of order and harmony. Isn't it intriguing and a little unsettling that such profound social control was exercised not on the battlefield or in the government buildings, but quietly over rice and bread, with chopsticks and hands? If you imagine those silent meals, it's almost like watching a delicate dance where every gesture counts and the tiniest misstep could disrupt the fragile social balance. The unspoken rules insisted that harmony was more valuable than personal expression. It makes you wonder about our own dining tables today. How often do we lose sight of the communal dance in favor of loud individualism or mindless scrolling through phones? Back then, the table was a stage where the soul of society was not just displayed, but actively constructed. Moreover, these strict social rules built a first line of defense against chaos, a way to tame human impulses in favor of collective good. In the samurai's silence, a deep sense of patience and control was cultivated, qualities essential in a world where a single misstep could cost one's life or honor. In the Greek meal's rigid structure, citizenship and social order were enforced quietly but relentlessly, embedding identity within daily life rather than lofty laws alone. The table was a training ground for discipline and social stamina, much like a dojo or a debating hall. It's worth noting how these silent, rule-bound meals also served to reinforce social boundaries, often brutally so. The servants who served quietly, the women begrudgingly relegated to peripheral rules, the slaves who ate separately, all these dynamics played out in nearly complete silence. As much as the table united, it also divided, reflecting the hierarchies and inequalities etched deeply into these societies. Those unspoken rules weren't innocent. They were the scaffolding of power, relayed as silently as the meals themselves. Yet, beyond all the hierarchy and control, there was also a profound beauty. In the quiet moments of shared meals, people found a sense of belonging to a family, a class, a nation. In silence, relationships were affirmed, not through words, but through presence and ritual. This unruffled order gave life a rhythm, a predictability that was both reassuring and essential in times often marked by unrest or uncertainty. So, as we close the chapter on silent meals and strict social codes from distant lands and times, the lesson feels surprisingly modern. Etiquette might seem tedious or old-fashioned, but at its core, it channels something deeply human, a desire for connection, respect, and structure, all served on a plate of unspoken understanding. The soundless customs of ye olde Japan and ancient Greece aren't relics, but reminders. How we break bread together shapes more than our meals. It shapes our societies, our identities, and ultimately, how we see ourselves in the grand theater of history. In the end, maybe the next time your phone buzzes at the dinner table, or someone chews a bit too loudly, pause for a moment. Behind those simple, silent lessons lies an ancient truth. Table manners are more than mere formality. They are a window into the soul of society, a quiet language through which civilizations speak to each other across centuries. And that, quite frankly, is rather dinner party fascinating.